It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this virtual conference on the economics effect and policy response to climate change and natural disasters. Thank you so much for joining us for this as we discuss recent policy research related to the economics of climate change, and we discuss available policy options to mitigate its negative economic consequences. This conference is both global and Africa focused. It is co-sponsored by the Poverty and Equity Global Practice of the World Bank and George Washington University's Institute for International Economic Policy. I would like to particularly thank Carolina Sanchez from the World Bank, who will chair and moderate the discussion with our keynote speakers, and thank Professor Remy Jadouab, who will moderate the second part of the conference. The issues for our discussion today directly resonate with our commitment to tackle climate change. COP26, which took place a few weeks ago in Glasgow, was another call for world leaders to reaffirm their commitment to take bold action against climate change. Such commitment is key since climate change and disasters disproportionately affect the poorest and the most vulnerable segments of society. If left unchecked, they may cause 216 million people to become internally displaced by 2050, and they can push as many as 132 million people into poverty by 2030. The World Bank Group is a very active player supporting climate action in developing countries with ambitious climate finance targets, and at least 50% of IDA-IBRD climate finance will support adaptation. On our end, we committed in our regional integration and cooperation assistance strategy to strongly enhance our engagement in reinforcing resilience to climate-induced shocks in a close alignment with the World Bank's Africa Climate Business Plan. As you know, designing and implementing effective policy responses to climate change requires us to have a deeper understanding of the economic impact of climate change, as well as how it affects human well-being, how it affects ecosystems, biodiversity, natural resources, how it impacts poverty, inequality, conflict, and fragility, among others. This is one of the key insights from a World Bank's Lake Chad Regional Economic Memorandum published just a few weeks ago, which highlights how the issues of climate change are intricately linked to development and other sources of fragility in the Lake Chad region. This is a region of the world that is most vulnerable to the negative consequences of climate change. So in this conference, we will have the opportunity to learn more about one of the background paper in this Lake Chad Regional Economic Memorandum, looking at the long-term economic effects of the shrinking of the lake. We will also listen to other rigorous policy research by leading academics studying the global economic and spatial effects of climate change, as well as the localized economic impacts of climate change and natural disasters in Africa. In light of the complex and far-reaching nature of climate change impacts, I appreciate the extensive breadth of these topics. I very much look forward to the discussion and the key insights that will come out of this conference. Thanks again for taking the time to share with us the results of your research. Next, I'm going to pass the floor to Carolina Sanchez, Director of the Poverty and Equity Global Practice of the World Bank, who will moderate the roundtable, introduce the speakers, and the floor is yours, Carolina.
Thank you very much, Boutheina. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks also to the organizers of the conference for inviting me to be a part of it and to chair this first session. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. We have a very exciting session ahead of us with 2 keynote speakers and a discussant, and then we'll make sure to leave some time at the end of the session for questions from the audience so that we can have an engaging discussion. Let me briefly introduce the 3 people that are joining us today. It's great to have with us Solomon Hsiang, who is the director of the Global Policy Laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley. Welcome. As well as Esteban Rossi-Hansberg, who is a distinguished service professor at the University of Chicago. Welcome, and thanks to both of you for joining us. And I also want to thank Richard Damania, who's the chief economist in the Sustainable Development Vice Presidency, for kindly agreeing to serve as a discussant to both presentations and probably highlight some of the linkages between what we are going to hear and some of the work that we are doing here in-house. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining. It's a lot of terrain to cover, so I'm going to pass the floor straight away to the speakers. But just a bit on the mechanics of the session. Each of the speakers will talk for about 25 minutes or so, and then we'll give Richard about 10 minutes to react. And then hopefully that gives us about 20 minutes for a Q&A. I will keep an eye on the chat, so please feel free to share comments and questions as we move forward, and I'll come back to those as we open up for discussion. So thank you again. And I guess, I don't know actually whether it's Solomon or Esteban who is starting. So whoever is Solomon, so the floor is yours. Go ahead. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a little bit early here in California at 6 a.m. and we have a newborn who might make an audible appearance. So apologies if this is not the most articulate presentation you've seen. So what I'd like to do is just to open up this sort of conference to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing and other members of the community have been doing, providing a bit of an overview. Thinking about both what has happened so far and where different research topics are actually going. And so, just to set the stage, climate change is one of those economic problems. Once you start thinking about it, it's really hard to start thinking about anything else. We're talking about a transformation of the entire world and the economic conditions in every single country. So here's a figure we put together in a review article at one point, just to give a sense of scale of the transformation we expect. On the bottom are the summertime temperatures of countries in the historical record. On the top are the summertime temperatures you might see in a high emission scenario of those same countries. And of course, everything shifted to the right. But what I think is most useful is to compare the top to the bottom. So, what we're talking about is in Canada, having summers in the future that could potentially look much more like summers currently in France. In China, we could see summers that look much more like current temperatures in Mexico. In countries like Indonesia, it might look more like Mali in the future. And then, of course, in Mali in the future, you're going to have, temperatures that look unlike anything we've seen in the world today. And I think just sort of trying to imagine that world helps you realize why there's so much research in this space and how big the challenge is. It's also worth, thinking about from a research standpoint where we started. So, for example, here's a QJE article from 1917, Ellsworth Huntington talking about climate change and its economic impacts on Rome. Bill Nordhaus released in the early 90s, the DICE model, sort of really helping us start to think about climate change management as an economic problem. And we've transitioned to a regime of work today that is very data-driven. So here's a figure from the Climate Impact Lab, which I run with some colleagues, on the mortality consequences of climate change around the world at high resolution in a probabilistic framework. So, we've moved a long way. And so what I want to do here is just touch on a couple different topics, briefly describe the recent progress and the future directions within those topics. And then I want to, at the very end, propose some new directions where I think there's not too many researchers working at the moment, but where I think added effort would be really valuable to society. And at the end, I'll touch on maybe some forecasting, since that's kind of what we all do here. So, just thinking about some recent progress, one of the major things that folks in the economics community have really been asking is just how does economic activity respond to the climate? And so I often think about this general problem in terms of this massive matrix in which, across the rows, we have all the different potential dimensions of the climate, temperature, rainfall, the kurtosis of rainfall, everything. And then along the columns, there's all sorts of economic outcomes we might care about. And in theory, we would like to know about all the populate this matrix. In reality, different econometricians have been taking on the problem and trying to uncover relationships between maybe temperature and energy or wildfires and health, but we don't really, we haven't populated this entire matrix. And then thinking about where we might go from here, there's some particular types of climate changes that almost nobody in the field is studying. And so, for example, it's really remarkable that ecosystem responses are a major impact that ecologists and scientists speak about all the time, but we have very little evidence or understanding of how changes in ecosystems are going to affect economic systems. Similarly, biodiversity, sea level rise is actually a topic that very few economists are working on. I know Esteban has worked on it, but we have very little empirical evidence of how to think about that. And so I think there are some major topics, some major roads here that folks of the community really could put some weight into. Another topic that has, I know has been something people at the bank have been thinking about, and many speakers here have worked on, is the effects of climate change and growth. Marshall, who's going to present later, has worked with me and others to think about this. And I think one of the, sort of controversial but important findings was that year over year changes in growth within individual countries have a strong association with temperature, and the structure of that association is itself a function of the average temperature in those countries where they start out. And so what you see here is this sort of concave hill-shaped function that describes changes in growth. And for any individual country, say Vietnam, you see this downward sloping effect of random draws of years, changes in temperature, leading to lower growth, higher temperature leading to lower growth rates. Whereas, I think from a development standpoint, what's going on at this right-hand side of this curve has really been important. I think one of the other key findings is that this relationship seems to be very pernicious. So in work with Tatiana, for example, we studied the United States, and we see the sort of same shape in terms of economic output across different temperatures over the decades. And on the right here is an IMF report, the World Economic Outlook from several years ago, where here what they're plotting is the derivative of the right-hand side of this curve. And you see across countries in their analysis, you get essentially the same slope over time. So it's very hard to sort of change the relationship between temperature and growth. And I think Marshall will talk more about this later. I think there's a lot of work to be done on this particular topic. I know it's very controversial, and a lot of people have looked at the reduced form relationships, but I think perhaps a more important question is asking what is really going on under the hood in the economy? Why is this happening? What is actually going on? There's been important work on human capital accumulation, but I think there's many other mechanisms that could be at play. In addition, it's been really difficult to reconcile cross-sectional and panel results or micro and macro results. There's a huge amount of work to be done here, and I would argue that this is one of the most important research areas. One of the controversial questions is really the persistence of these effects, whether or not they last for a very, very long time or not. In some of our work, we've asked whether or not these effects last, say, 5 years. But when we talk about climate change, we're talking about 80 years. And so asking about that level of persistence is quite important. And then I think the last bullet point here is quite relevant. What do we know about policies that might actually disrupt this linkage? Because at the end of the day, if this is happening around the world, what we'd like to do is take action so that it stops happening. Another important area in which progress has been made has been thinking about different questions about social stability and how the climate might affect those. There's been lots of different studies linking the effects of different dimensions of climate, whether it's temperature or rainfall or something else, to different types of conflict. So this is just a graph to think about all the different types of conflict that have been studied. We call this kind of the spectrum of violence, where on the left you have, large-scale institutional changes, things like civilizations collapsing, which is primarily observed in the historical record, intergroup violence, but could be more organized in the form of civil war or less organized in the form of riots. And then interpersonal violence that comes in the form of sort of sports violence or homicide, sexual assault, and even now in newer studies, intrapersonal violence, individuals using violence against themselves as a function of temperature or changes in the environment. And I think, so that sort of basic reduced form relationship has been quite important, but there are other important things we've learned as well. So for example, on the left is an important paper by Anush Masirian and Wolfram Schlenker, showing that asylum applications to the European Union respond to local temperature changes within countries of a form. So there's this sort of quadratic shape where higher temperatures lead to greater rates of asylum applications. And the form of this actually looks like the crop response in those source countries. So there's a lot of concern that climate change could be destabilizing for populations and causing mobilization of populations, although we know very little about the details there. On the right is actually an important paper by Timo Fetzer looking at one particular policy that might actually interfere with these relationships. And what you see is that with the rollout of NREGA, there was less conflict in Indian communities associated with the monsoon. And so there's a little bit of evidence we have from a few studies there, but there is a lot more we could do. So I think in this vein of research, a key question has been, what are the mechanisms? And we've written a lot about that. There's, I think, increasing evidence that there's economic channels and psychology channels at play, with some role for government capacity to be responding to the climate. Those all seem to be interlinked somehow. The question of what might actually happen with migration, I think, is of tremendous importance, and it's very difficult. So I think, Esteban will speak a little bit about that, and I think others have been trying to understand that question. We don't know so much about, sort of the endogenous response of political systems. Once things become unstable and start changing, then how is it that governance systems are going to react to those changes? We have very little understanding there. And then again, what can we do from a policy perspective to interfere with this relationship? If we wanted to stabilize societies, populations, what would we do as the climate starts changing? I think this is a case in which tools for machine learning could become quite important, because essentially you're facing a prediction problem and a forecasting problem. Changes in adaptation has been a big topic of study going forward. So this is a figure from a review article we did, but I think what it does is it illustrates how we think about adaptation. This is a graph sort of just showing how these different studies are conducted. You have a PDF of some climate variable, climate 1, and a change, climate 2. You have draws from those distributions. Those are realizations in panel B. And then you have a dose response function that us econometricians are trying to recover, F1 and F2. And the thing here that's most important is that, adaptation occurs when the climate shifts and people change their response. So you go from F1 to F2, and something under the hood in society is changing that causes the relationship to change. And then we try to measure that on the back end. So I think we've gotten quite good at measuring those different types of adaptation benefits, which are, what you see in these curves in panel C. I think another important advance, something that we've worked on quite a bit, is thinking about how do we recover adaptation costs. So people might change their behavior in a way that you see lower mortality, on high temperature days, but there's something else they're doing that is costly, is the cost of protecting themselves. And that's actually often more difficult to observe. So there have been a few studies now trying to use revealed preference approaches to try and back out what the implied costs might be doing. And that is helping us recognize that we should account for both adaptation benefits, but also their costs. There's also, a large literature, a rapidly growing literature on the role of income in populations' ability to adapt. And so here's a graph from a recent paper showing the effect of temperature on energy consumption, looking either at, the label got cut off. So the top panel here is looking at all fuels consumption, and the bottom panel here, set of panels, is looking at the effect on electricity consumption. And what you see is that, below median incomes, which is everything in the left panels, basically the, changes in temperature don't lead to any changes in energy or heating consumption. Actually, I think I got the fuel types switched here. And I think the important point is that, the role of adaptation doesn't kick in for societies until they reach higher incomes. And that is important, especially when we project changes going forward, as you see on the lower part of the panel, because many populations in the future are still not going to be super rich for the next 80 years. And so we need to think about what resources populations actually have at their disposal when trying to adapt to changes in the climate. So, where might future work be going? I think questions about the information that populations actually are using to adapt are really important and are incredibly hard to study. So it is very difficult to understand when people's expectations about the climate have changed. And I think that's something, how important people's understanding of the climate is to the extent of their adaptation is going to be crucial. I also think when we say, we see that income matters or the climate matters, that's kind of a reduced form cross-partial derivative that we're talking about, but we don't actually know what people are doing in the background to cause those changes that we see. And I think, from a policy perspective, we really need to understand what actions, in the form of technologies that are being adopted or policies that are being deployed, that are effective in terms of allowing populations to adapt. And that's going to be important to understand empirically, because presumably in countries that haven't deployed those policies or technologies, we're going to want them to be deployed. And so we want to deploy things that work. And so this is, there's a role for people to be conducting field experiments and starting to really take that question quite seriously. And thinking about risk, there's been a lot of progress. This is actually a field where there's been a lot of theory. Here is a picture of the climate sensitivity. So this background color blue distribution is a climate sensitivity that describes changes in temperature we might expect to see by end of century, according to different models. And what you see are also a bunch of different maps at each temperature. So even conditional on a change being only 3 degrees C, the spatial distribution of the climate changes we expect to observe is itself quite uncertain. And I know Jonathan's going to be talking about that. So I think there's many different dimensions to risk that we are trying to study here. And one thing that's worth pointing out is even the climate models that we tend to study, those are the ones that are this solid map in the picture. There's these translucent maps that are what we call sort of synthetic models, where we're trying to capture what realizations at the tails of the distribution might look like. But the climate models we often talk about actually do not replicate the tails very well. In part, I think that's because, climate modeling teams don't want to show up with a model that's like way out of the distribution of what's normal. So here there's been also a lot of progress. I think here in particular, thinking about the theoretical literature has been quite important. So for example, on the left, thinking about how tipping points, which represent a particular type of risk, change what we would think of as the social cost of carbon over time, or Martin Weitzman's important work on the dismal theorem, for example, on the right, pointing out that with like really high levels of consumption loss, you want to have really extreme discount rates. And I think there's been a lot of theoretical progress. One thing as the empirical literature sort of meets the theoretical literature is asking questions about whether or not different types of uncertainty should actually be managed or valued in the same way. And so what I mean there is, like, on the right is a projection from like one of the Climate Impact Lab studies, where you see the sort of fanning out of mortality projections over time. And that is the result of considering a large number of physical climate models, thinking about a lot of spatial patterns that could emerge, and then resampling from a parameter space that is quite large. And the reality is that those different types of uncertainty have very different sources, and they can be changed in different ways. So for example, parameter uncertainty depends on what I do as an econometrician. I might be able to estimate a model that has larger or smaller standard errors, and then that would change what I think the future looks like. Should society be pricing the spread that comes from estimation uncertainty from known forms of uncertainty that result from physical processes the same way? And I don't think we have a good sense of that. And then I know that a lot of people are thinking about this, but it's probably one of the most important questions is how we manage globally aggregate risk, sort of the risk that can't be insured at the global level. And that's a really important topic I think people will be working on for a while. Another area that was mentioned in the opening, which has grown a lot in importance, is thinking about the unequal burden of climate change around the world. And so there's many people who've been working on this. Here are just two figures from studies that I've participated in, sort of highlighting different ways in which there are tremendously unequal consequences of warming at the global scale. So on the left is a projection using the growth results I showed in the beginning, by end of century, and sort of just trying to think through the full set of uncertainty that might result from those projections. But one thing you see, the colors of red go across the tropics and the subtropics, and the bluer regions are locations that could actually potentially benefit in terms of overall productivity from warming, because they're sort of accelerating growth rates as they go from very cold to more temperate temperatures. And that causes divergence of incomes that you see in the projections at the bottom of the panel. Similarly, if you look at mortality consequences of warming in the right-hand panel, If you look at the higher incomes, you actually see that there can sometimes be benefits from warming as you reduce cold-related deaths. And then as you move to lower and lower incomes, we see higher and higher mortality rates as a result of warming. That's largely due, again, to the initial temperatures at which populations inhabit today, causing the marginal effect of warming to be very different for different populations. So this has tremendous implications that I think are getting more attention. It's really important to understand the different causes of this inequality. So, whether it's a situation in which everybody sort of is responding in a similar way from a health perspective, but some populations start out hotter, like Model 1 here on the graph on the right, or is it that low-income populations just don't have enough resources to respond and they're doing something very differently? That presents an opportunity for policymakers to step in and for transfers to make a really big difference. I think what this is going to do in future work is we're going to have, it's really difficult now to use representative agent models and make the case that they actually capture what people around the world are going to experience, because the experiences will be so diverse. There's also a practice within some of the climate economics literature of using something called Negeshi weights, which basically downweight low-income populations, the marginal utility of consumption of those populations, to make sure that the models don't produce unrealistic results in which transfers all move to low-income countries. I think it's becoming increasingly clear that that's just sort of ethically indefensible, and they're going to probably be exercised from the different models that have been using them historically. And then what I think the last bullet point is quite important, which is when we do these global welfare calculations, I don't think there has been a discussion about how we are weighting the utility of different populations that are contemporaries over time. There's been a lot of focus on populations at the same location, at different moments in time, discounting in the future and the past, but very little discussion of how you weight populations contemporaneously. And that turns out to be extremely important, probably as important as discounting. I want to get close to wrapping up. So, the social cost of carbon and integrated assessment is a space in which there's been a lot of work. I showed the early study by Bill Nordhaus. On the left are two different maps from key models that have played a big role in at least setting the United States social cost of carbon, the DICE model and the FUN model. As you can see, they're sort of spatially coarse, and there's been a lot of criticism of the different types of sectors and how they're described. So I think one big improvement has been trying to, introduce some empirical rigor and structure to understanding the different impacts of climate change you see on the right. So that's one of the efforts at the Climate Impact Lab that we have put a lot of time and energy into. So we project impacts at over 20,000 regions around the world for a variety of sectors empirically. And what I'm showing you here are impacts for several different sectors. And what that lets you do is that lets you plug into these models what we call damage functions that index damages for each sector as a function of the climate that are empirically derived and based on real world data. So going forward, I think integrated assessment is going to have to value uncertainty and inequality like we've been talking about. Having systematic approaches to updating will be important. And in reality, we'll talk about this in a sec, but internationally harmonizing the SCC seems like a really important practical concern. Having countries use very different SCCs is going to lead to all sorts of different types of issues. And then also developing an approach to the SCC that is sort of internally consistent with loss and damage and other international discussions will be important. So I want to transition. So there's been a lot of progress. I think in those topics we'll be moving forward, but I want to point people in a few different directions if they're thinking about future research, because I'm hoping more people will study these different topics. So first of all, all of the climate change projections, if you're looking at climate variables, depend on economic forecasts that generate the emission scenarios. We rely a lot on something called the shared socioeconomic pathways. These were developed by a handful of modelers and decades ago as an approach that would standardize the emission scenarios across the physical climate models so that they could be compared to one another. But these were not designed for economic analysis, and they were not actually really designed to be particularly realistic either. And so I think we need to get a bunch of economists involved in developing the next generation of projections that we are all using to think about what might happen going forward. That's a major area. I know a few people are starting to jump into that. Another key topic that I think people haven't been studying as much is sort of what's going to happen when, say, we were to price carbon implicitly or explicitly. What does that really mean for the global financial system? So just for a sense of scale, global CO2 emissions right now are about 40 billion tons. suppose we took the Obama SEC of $60 a ton, that means that current annual emissions are valued at $2.4 trillion, which is about 3% of current global GDP. That's on par with the overall economic impact of COVID globally. So when we're talking, that's creating a tremendous amount of value, literally out of thin air. And that's going to create an asset that is going to start being traded and has to have a certain amount of credibility, will introduce volatility into other markets. I don't know that we have a very, is that going to cause inflationary pressure once we start, creating these assets and just handing them out in different ways? So also, an important element of this is thinking about how this price of the SEC, of this asset, is controlled. So for example, on the right, there's just two bars, the Obama SEC and the Trump SEC, that were changed very abruptly by a very small committee of individuals in the US federal government that were political appointees, turning the dial on a few parameters. And so do we want to allow for, assets of this scale to be vulnerable to that type of price manipulation is quite important. Another major topic is how we forecast innovation. We are not very good at it. So on the right is the famous IEA projections every year for what solar adoption is going to look like. Those are the blue lines. What actually happened is the red line. And so what you just see is that year over year, the forecasts are wrong. And it's very hard to update we're not updating the forecasts in a way that reflects what we've been seeing historically. There's very little work trying to forecast technological innovation, but anyone who works in this space knows that that's the weak underbelly of all of these different studies. And so, what do the current markets indicate about future forecasts? What policies can be deployed to accelerate innovation changes? That is something that I think is not being studied in this literature. And then I do want to wrap up. So just one point is that geoengineering, I think people have heard about it, but I don't know that everyone's really taking it as seriously as they should. And so I think in the economics community, it's a little bit more on the fringe, but the economic pressures at play are tremendous. And I think it's going to become increasingly difficult to justify just ignoring the topic. So there's just lots of research questions on geoengineering that I think need to be studied very seriously. And then lastly, this kind of sounds almost silly, but we need some practical strategies for what's going to happen in developing economies. I think everyone says we would like for them to not have enormous emissions. At the same time, we would like for them to not have their economic development hindered. What are they supposed to do? I hear people talk about like solar and microgrids and stuff, but those don't seem scalable in a way that we really, that can reconcile those two problems. And so I think just sort of really practical plans for what should be done is going to matter. And then the very last topic I want to point people in the direction of is thinking about changing how we do treaty design. So I think with the recent COP, everyone has come home realizing that Paris didn't really work that great. We have a very large treaty design literature in economics that focuses a lot on developing incentive-compatible, self-enforcing sort of agreements. But what we're seeing around the world is that the actual treaties are being pulled apart by adversarial players, right? You have industries that are strategically acting in a way to undermine the success of treaties. And that is not built into anything in the economic models I've seen. So developing an approach in which we design treaties to withstand that type of adversarial pressure is, I think, something that economists could really help out with. And I think no one has really worked on. I'll skip this. So, well, actually, this is very important for you. I think the one thing, taking experience from COVID, we've seen the important role of global and national institutions in helping populations adopt new policies or strategies. So think about the vaccine rollout. How important has it been that different agencies have said this is a safe and effective technology to use to cope with the global challenge we're facing? We don't have anything like that similar to climate change adaptation technologies. Right now, you can go out on the market and people will sell you weather control technologies, and there is no one to verify if they work or don't work. And so I think we don't have the necessary institutional infrastructure set up for us to succeed and deploy these policies in a way where populations can be confident and actually ensure that they're adopting cost-effective strategies. So those need to be built up. So I'm just gonna, so going forward, what do I think is gonna happen in the next 10 years in the research space? Based on sort of what I've been showing you, my guess is that policy is gonna really be driven by testable models that have verifiable data. I think historically we've relied on theory and numerical models a lot, but it's going to, the stakes, if we're talking about these trillions of dollars per year, there's going to be a tremendous amount of pressure to make it clear why we are doing what we are doing. Adaptation strategies in the future are going to become much more data-driven. It will be much less about argument and intuition, and it will be clear, what the various costs and benefits of adaptation strategies will look like. A huge focus is going to be on the practical challenges of integrating trillions of dollars of new carbon-based assets with the rest of the economy. I don't think we have a sense of exactly how to do that in a clear way. I think geoengineering is going to become a huge research area in the next 10 years. It's just too important. And hopefully, this is a bit hopeful on the last point, we'll design a global treaty that actually works. And maybe economists can play a role there. So I'm going to wrap up. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And, it's nice to end up with that sort of more hopeful tone after some, pretty sobering data. So I'm going to pass it over to Esteban to go through the second presentation. The floor is yours.
So it's great to talk after Solomon because he sets up the stage so well on this topic, and he covers so much ground. I'm going to follow a slightly different strategy, or a very different strategy. Namely, I'm going to talk about some particular research that is trying to propose assessment model for global warming, for changes in temperature, and the impact that changes in temperature are going to have in different parts of the world. And so what we're trying, or the goal of what we're trying to do, is to provide such a model in a way that takes into account some of the key aspects associated with global warming. And three in particular are, that this is a dynamic phenomenon that happens over many years. It's already affecting the economy today, but it's going to affect the economy over many years, centuries forward. It's a global externality, as we all know, but importantly and very specifically for this work, it's a phenomenon that has very heterogeneous effects across locations, and so I'm already talked about some of them. And we want to incorporate these kind of basic aspects of global warming in a model in which we can do an assessment of how costly this will be for different regions, but we want to do it in a way that takes into account the behavioral responses of agents. Namely, we don't want to simply estimate like an empirical relationship. We want to introduce the actions of these agents, the behavioral responses of these agents to changes in temperature, and then explicitly aggregate those behavioral responses to have implications, quantitative implications on how different locations are going to fare as a result of that. And that's going to allow us to incorporate different forms of adaptation, both in terms of migration, so agents are going to be able to move across locations, in terms of trade, and in terms of developing new areas that potentially can are not as affected by climate or can benefit from climate. And so we think it's important to do that because this is exactly the way modern economics has evolved. We've understood that if we want to think about how the economy reacts to
that's it, Omar. Nothing to add.
Please mute. We are getting some sound for one of the participants. Thank you.
If we wanna think about how the economy is going to react to different phenomena, kind of what the big lesson from modern economics is, we need to go to the ground up, and we need to build it from the ground up, because we need to understand how individual agents are going to react to it, and then do that explicit aggregation. And so that's kind of what we want to put on the table, a model that does that. And to do so, we're going to start from the core economic model. It's some work that we've done with Klaus Desmet and David Nagy, in which we've proposed a dynamic spatial equilibrium model where there's and let me kind of try to explain the core characteristics of this model with this diagram. I won't go into the detailed equations, etc. But hopefully with this diagram you can kind of get an idea of how the model works. So think about many locations in the world. I'll show you maps and the type of resolution that we're going to use in the quantification in a second. There's individuals and there's firms, and that live and produce in particular regions. Firms produce particular goods that they can trade subject to trade costs with other parts of the world. And they also have an option to innovate. And if they do so, then their productivity improves, and that's going to lead to local growth in particular regions where firms invest a lot, relative to regions where firms may decide not to invest that much. And the main driver of these investments is the market size of these firms. So if you're in an area in which you can sell to many consumers, and there's kind of there's a lot of consumption around you, you can reach those consumers at low cost, then you're going to have incentives to innovate. And so the level of productivity in turn affects factor prices, and consumers are going to look at those factor prices and are going to look at the local amenities, how attractive it is to live in a particular location, and they're going to decide whether they want to stay in where they are or whether they want to migrate somewhere else, they want to move somewhere else. Okay, so this is the kind of the basic, in a very kind of a nutshell, the way the core economic model works. And of course, because there's many locations and these locations are evolving over time through these investments in productivity, this is kind of a spatial growth model. Now, what we're adding in this research to this core spatial growth model is first energy as a factor of production. So firms are using this energy, and they can choose whether they want to produce energy using clean technologies or fossil fuels. If they use fossil fuels, that leads to CO2 emissions that affect the stock of carbon in the atmosphere through a standard carbon cycle, which in turn leads to changes in global temperatures that then can be downscaled into changes in local temperatures. And these changes in local temperatures are the ones that are going to affect productivity. So these changes in local temperatures are going to affect productivity to three main channels. The first one, they can affect local temperatures can affect productivity directly. So and I'll show you kind of our estimates of that relationship. They can have, local temperatures can affect amenities in a given location. So how attractive it is to live in that location, and they can also affect natality rates, namely birth minus death rates. And so these are the three potential local effects of changes in local temperatures on the economy. And so when climate changes, it's going to affect these three local characteristics, and by affecting these three local characteristics, it's going to affect the whole global economy. And we want to kind of trace that and aggregate that up to see what's going to be the impact of overall global warming. And so we're going to quantify this model at the 1 degree by 1 degree spatial resolution. The baseline year we're going to use is 2000. And we're gonna quantify both the trade and mobility frictions, so the cost of trading and the cost of moving, such that the model satisfies kind of a gravity equation, which is kind of the standard for trade, and matches migration flows, or net migration flows, I should say, as we see them in the data. And so we're using lots of data kind of in baseline years in order to quantify this model, and then try to get a kind of a realistic model of the world economy. So one of the key aspects in which, so this model has two-way feedback, right? In the sense that when the economy uses carbon, that leads to these emissions, which in turn affect the economy, and how much the economy produces determines how much carbon is used, which in turn affects climate again. So this two-way feedback is there, but one crucial aspect of this is that when carbon is emitted, it mixes quickly in the atmosphere. So that's the reason or one of the reasons it's a global externality, and that affects global temperatures. But those global temperatures then have to be downscaled into, or have an effect on local temperatures, and that effect is very heterogeneous. And so in particular, like a 1 degree increase in global temperatures has about a 2 degree effect in very northern latitudes, but a much smaller effect in some other areas in the world, say in Central America or parts of South America and Australia. And so there's already lots of heterogeneity in the way global temperatures affect local temperatures, or changes in the stock of carbon, I guess is a better way of saying it, affect local temperatures. Now, the other important source of heterogeneity, perhaps even more important, is the fact that when local temperatures change, that's going to affect economic conditions in a particular location differentially, depending on what's the average temperature in that location. And so kind of an important part of the quantification of this type of models is to have a damage function that maps changes in local temperatures into changes in fundamentals. And it's very important that these are changes in fundamentals, not on outcomes. Because of course, if you just estimate a relationship between changes in temperatures and changes in outcomes, then that includes all the adaptation that happens in the economy. We want to do it on fundamentals. And so how are we going to do it? The way we're going to do it is we're going to take the model that we have and ask, well, what are the productivities and amenities that make this setup exactly match the levels of population and output that we see at this local level in all these different locations in 4 different years. And so that's going to give us a panel of these fundamental productivities and amenities in the different locations in the world. And it's this panel that we're going to use to estimate these damage functions. So that's going to give us kind of local effects of changes in local temperature on amenities and productivities. And for that, we're going to use this type of panel regression, where we're going to estimate semi-elasticities of temperature on amenities and productivities by temperature bin. Okay, and then we're going to add local fixed effects so that we're not identifying out of the cross section and some trends at a more aggregate level. And so what that yields at the end of the day is the damage functions that you see at the bottom. So here what I have is winter temperature. So these are the coldest places in the world. These are the warmest places in the world. And what this is telling you is that in the coldest places in the world, changes, a 1 degree change, 1 degree Celsius increase in local temperature leads to increases in amenities of about 2.5%. And that then comes down, right? Eventually crosses 0. And when you go to the warmest places in the world, that effect is negative. So amenities are decline as a result of increases in local temperatures. And so this pattern is not imposed at all, right? This is the result of this estimation, but it comes in a kind of very intuitive way. It comes out very intuitively that with this pattern in which, you know, the coldest places gain from changes in temperature, from increases in temperature, while the warmest places lose. And the same is true for productivity, but their effects are, if you look at the scale, quite a bit larger. So what this is saying, in the warmest places in the world, 1 degree Celsius increase decreases local productivity by about 15% or so. So that's big. And what this estimation shows you is, I mean, there's very significant effects here in the tails, but we're also quite uncertain about the level of these effects. I mean, the estimation is not very precise. And that's partly because the panel is not that long, because we don't have economic information at this level of resolution for that many years. Okay. So then we're going to combine this. We need a model also, or we need to incorporate the cost of fossil fuels and clean energy. We're going to do so in a way that matches the relative use of these two technologies at the local level. But one extra important component is that we want to incorporate the fact that as more fossil fuels are used, their cost increases. And so we're going to use this paper by Bauer to obtain this relationship between cumulative emissions and the cost of using fossil fuels. Okay, and so when we put it all together, this is the type of, we can solve them all forward. We can solve them all for as many years as we want. And so I'm going to show you one particular realization for the average damage functions that I just showed you. And so I'm going to run the model for the next 400 years, starting in 2000. And so these are CO2 emissions. You start where CO2 emissions were in 2000, and this is the evolution. The green line is the evolution of CO2 emissions that you're going to see over time. So those are going to increase according to this. There's no policy here, so this is business as usual. And then eventually they start declining because the cost of extracting carbon start growing. And so you can see how that relates to different IPCC scenarios, RCP 8.5 or RCP 6.0. And so this is kind of closer to the RCP 8.5. And this is the evolution of temperatures, or the implied evolution of temperatures, which is also kind of close to that scenario. So this is a pretty extreme scenario that I'm showing you. And that's what, the model yields without imposing any sort of policy on the economy. And so, of course, as temperatures increase, that's going to affect local amenities and local productivities. And so here I'm showing you maps of how those are going to look by 2200. And so, and what this is telling you is, well, there's an area here, right, in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia that is going to suffer in terms of amenities substantially. There's an area here that is going to gain about 30-40% in terms of amenities by then. And then there is the kind of the rich world, the US, Europe, etc., that is kind of at the cusp, is kind of in between these areas that lose and these areas that gain. And the map for productivities looks kind of similar. It's not exactly the same, but looks similar, but the effects are larger. So in these blue areas, productivity is going to be about half as large as it would be without global warming. The rich world, again, doesn't lose or gain that much. And then there's some areas in the very northern latitudes that gain in terms of productivity. Okay, so that's what comes out of this. And so if I put that in the model, these changes in local temperatures are gonna motivate agents to move and react. They're also gonna imply changes in natality rates. The overall effect on natality rates is relatively small. So here I'm showing you the evolution of population generated by the model compared to the UN projections. And there's two curves there. It's hard to distinguish them because there's about a 30 million people difference between the two in the scenario with warming relative to no warming. So that tells you that, the implications on global total populations are relatively small, but the implications on where those people are going to be are quite large. So this is a map of relative population without in basic scenario relative to no warming by 2200. So what the model says is by 2200, there's going to be 600 million climate movers, or people that are going to be in a different location as a result of global warming, and where they're going to leave, again, these areas of the world, and they're going to be in 2200 in the red areas. But of course, the progression of how they get there is that they don't go there immediately necessarily. The progression may be that they kind of move slowly through Europe and through the US as they start populating some of the more northern latitudes. But that's a large number of climate immigrants. And if you put it all together and look at welfare, this is what you get. So focus on the map on the left. Again, the blue areas are places that are going to lose as a result of global warming. The red or yellow areas are places that are projected to win from these changes in temperature. And again, I didn't emphasize it enough, but of course, we're looking just at the effect of temperatures. There's, as Solomon pointed out very forcefully, there's many other type of impacts of climate change that should be added to this. But what this tells you is that, is these regions in the world, in Central Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central and South America, that are going to lose, and they're potentially going to lose quite a bit in this scenario, about 15% in the most severely damaged areas. But there's other areas that are gonna gain from this. And on the right, you have the population-weighted distribution of these welfare effects. And so you see that there's clearly two peaks, right? There's the rich world that is affected, but not so much. And then there is the developing world that is much more heavily affected. And so, if we were gonna talk about it, so the story here is really what's happening in some of these poorest areas in the world. And so what this graph shows you is the relationship between GDP per capita and these welfare effects that I showed that I just showed you in the map. And so you can see how, countries that are richer, right? So I also color coded this depending on, how the level of development of this area, or just group different parts of the world. And so OECD is over here, Sub-Saharan Africa is in yellow over there. And so you can see how, places that are poorer are going to be much more affected by climate change. So in particular, what this relationship, if you kind of just fit a curve there, what this relationship tells you is a location that has double the income per capita is on average going to experiment losses from climate change that are about 1.5% lower. Not because they are richer. That's not the mechanism. It just happens that the geography of the world is such that these are the effects. The economic geography of the world is such that these are the effects. It's not causal, of course. It's just the way the predicted welfare effects are going to look. And so what this implies is, of course, that this is going to increase inequality, right? That the big story is, yes, there's some level effects overall for the world, but the big issue is that it's going to create increase inequality, and the gap between the effects on the regions that are the most affected and are also the poorest regions in the world, and the richest regions in the world and the regions that are going to gain the most out of this is huge. It's about 30 percentage points. Okay. Now, needless to say, there's lots of uncertainty about all of this, and so particularly there's lots of uncertainty about the average effects that come out of this type of assessment models. So here what we've done is we've taken the uncertainty in the estimation of the damage functions that I showed you, and we kind of filter that uncertainty through the model. And that gives you confidence intervals for average effects over time. And so say by 2200, what this is telling you is that the 95% confidence interval is between no effect and 20%. And so that's kind of obviously a lot, like a very big, large range. So we're quite uncertain. I mean, this is still informative, of course, but we're quite uncertain about the exact level of these average effects. We're less uncertain, though, about the range of the difference between the effects on the places that are going to be the most affected relative to the places that are the least affected. Those in very extreme scenarios, or in very not as extreme scenarios, that range doesn't change that much and stays more or less stable. And you can see that in the sense that kind of how wide these distributions are for the different scenarios is similar. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar. Okay, so let me use the last couple of minutes to talk about two things. First, there's of course, when these damage functions that we estimate on these fundamentals, right? They yield very large effects, but these are effects on fundamentals. These are not effects on actual outcomes. And the reason, of course, is that there's a lot of adaptation going on in the background. It's costly to adapt, it's costly to move, it's costly to trade, etc. But you can do it. And so, one big issue is that if you increase the cost of adaptation, for example, if you increase the cost of moving, right, the effects of global warming are going to be much larger. And so this is what this is showing you. if I increase migration costs by 25%, say you start seeing these climate refugees and countries start closing their borders, the effects of climate change on the economy are going to be quite a bit larger in this calculation, about a third larger. And the geography of that is kind of interesting in the sense that, you know, if migration costs are larger, that of course affects negatively the regions that were benefiting from, you know, people moving in and from more investment moving in. But they're also going to be affect negatively some of the regions that were sending kind of migrants out, and they were kind of coping with this that way. And so in some sense, increases in migration costs are going to affect negatively both the northern latitudes and parts of Central Africa, not so for South America or Australia. Why? Because for those places, migration is not so beneficial. Why? Because migration also empties out a lot of these regions, and if they empty out, they lose kind of the needed density for development, and so that's kind of a potential concern from migration for certain areas as well. And so this map kind of looks different than some of the maps that I've shown you in the past. Okay, so I'm running out of time, but of course, you know, once you set up a model like this, then one of the benefits is that we can go ahead and try many different types of policies on it and use it as a laboratory to think about these policies and think about the local effects of a lot of these policies. So we've done some of this work, not that much of this work. Let me talk very briefly about carbon taxes. If you put so carbon taxes are obviously, like, you know, one of the most commonly mentioned policy solutions for this by economists. There's all the practical issues of imposing them, or, you know, imposing a price on carbon, many of which Salomon was talking about. But let me just kind of give you a basic sense of what carbon taxes do in this type of economy. Because so what I'm going to do is I'm going to impose a carbon tax that is uniform in the world. It's going to be rebated locally, and I have different levels in this graph. And so, you know, naturally, once you impose a carbon tax, that reduces carbon emissions at impact, and it reduces carbon emissions for many years if you keep the tax constant. But eventually, there's this dynamic effect by which, because you've used less carbon, extracting carbon is cheaper than it would be had you used more. And so that kind of cancels out part or eventually all of the tax. And so what that means is that the carbon tax is essentially delaying the consumption of carbon rather than eliminating the consumption of carbon when you take a very long perspective. And so what that does is that it reduces temperatures for many years, but it essentially kind of flattens this curve because the carbon is eventually used anyway. And so you have this kind of flattening of the temperature curve. And that can be beneficial, but it's costly today, beneficial in the future. And so the benefits are you know, depend a lot on the discount factor, but also are not as large as we would think they should be, because of this effect that you're essentially just flattening the curve, right? That carbon eventually kind of gets used because of this effect that I was talking about. And so it's kind of very important. What comes out of this in terms of policy is something that someone was also kind of emphasizing, is the importance of other forms of technology. He talked about geoengineering. Let me just group all of that in some sort of abatement technology by which we can deal with this, because then delaying the use of carbon, of course, becomes very effective. It's a very effective policy tool because we can delay it, and eventually we get those technologies to work. And once they work, that helps us solve the problem itself. Okay. We also tried other policies like clean energy subsidies. Those are not that effective in this model because the world grows as a result of them, and that uses more energy, and so that cancels out the effect of the substitution effect from the policy. So in this setup, that's not this particular policy is not as effective. Okay, so thank you for your attention, and you know, hopefully this motivates people to think about these type of frameworks as useful to, as like I said, as laboratories to think about different types of policies. There's many other policy exercises that we can think about, but we think it's very important to use frameworks that are micro-founded, that include behavioral responses, and that do explicit aggregation from these behavioral responses in a way that takes into account these adaptation mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna go straight to Richard, but before I do so, I just wanna explain how to submit questions in case people are not clear about that, although we already have a few. If you haven't figured out how that works, you go to the bottom right corner of your screen and there are 3 little dots there. And if you click on those, you'll get something that says Q&A, and then that opens up the Q&A window, and you are then able to put your comment or question through so that we can all see it. So please continue to do that, and we'll come back to your questions right after we hear from Richard. So Richard, the floor is yours.
Okay, look, thank you very, very much. Firstly, thank you, Carolina. Thank you, Remy. Thank you, Carlos, so much for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here and to be speaking to all of you, but it's a special honor to be commenting on, papers by Esteban and Solomon, were the foremost researchers, the first amongst equals. And really, we've heard so much, there's not a huge amount that I can add. So to try to add some value added to what I might say, what I thought I would do is expand on some of the themes that we've heard about, what we know and what we don't know, in this enormous active area of research. And really what we've heard most about is the what question. What is the impact of climate change? But then I want to go into the next question that everyone is interested in as well, is so how do we tackle the problem? And that is, if you like, the end of Esteban's paper and also the end of what we heard from Solomon. So what we've heard so far and what we've seen is something which is really, really significant, especially in Esteban's model. In my very humble opinion, this is state of the art, and there's probably nothing quite as sophisticated as what you've seen. It has a long horizon that spans 400 years. If you're going to go to 400 years, then you really need to work your model on some basic fundamentals rather than over-model and have details, because the projections are going to be flatly wrong. We don't know what's going to happen in 400 years. Then, of course, you've got the level of spatial disaggregation, which is quite unusual in these models. What I think is really good value added is the endogeneity of adaptation. We've had very many models, much work that's been happening, where you just simply assume that climate change comes, people drown or they get poor. There's no endogenous adaptation. I think that's really good. And one of the key results that comes out about migration, we'll talk about later. And then, of course, there is the abatement technology. And in Solomon's work, of course, we saw a survey of a lot of the empirical literature. And one of the challenges of the empirical literature is identifying what is climate and what is weather. The world has already seen, let's say, something like a 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature, but how much of the responses that we are inferring empirically is due to changes in weather, a short-run response, rather than a longer-term signal that we would like to have. And one of the things that really comes out, whether you look at the models, empirical models that's done, or whether you look at models based on estimation, as we've seen, as Esteban emphasized a lot, is there's an awful lot of uncertainty. And what we see is that uncertainty, at least in my view, tends to increase when we go from studying biological impacts to economic impacts. Of course, in 200 years, heating will have the same effect on ice and on crops as it does today. But the economy of 150 or 200 years from today will be very, very different. So the spikes of uncertainty really enlarge when we go from trying to project or say anything that goes from biological to economic. Just to reinforce the point, let me give you something that was done in terms of an exercise of the 15 big CGE models, where they were all the modelers were forced to use the same scenarios of the NDCs, use the same data and the same calibration over the same time period. These are the big models. Some of them have had millions of dollars in them. Some of them the World Bank also uses and the IMF also uses. And what we see are very, very, very significant differences in what we would expect for the same scenarios, the same policies to actually come out across the same family of models. And that is emphasizing something that Solomon also brought out, is it's not just parameter uncertainty, but it's also model uncertainty that we need to be tremendously worried about. So given all of this, what can be some of the takeaways and what do we see in terms of the commonalities across the models? I think the first and most important thing that we've actually learned, and this is especially important for economists and macroeconomists, is that climate change, we have now established, I think very well, is a core macroeconomic concern with two-way causality. It is not a privilege of growth. It is not an afterthought from growth. It is deeply intertwined with growth. Growth affects climate change, and climate change in turn affects growth. So this is a big economic problem that we need to take into the mainstream of economics. The second strong conclusion that emerges, especially from the last few slides that Esteban showed us, is something that I'm going to call the equator principle. This is not the equator principle of the IMF or the IFC, which talks of managing natural resource rents. This is the fact that the closer you get to the equator, the worse are the impacts of climate change. And all models, whether it is empirical or simulation-based, come up with this result. So much so that at times it can become unlivable. And as a consequence, if you're going to get those differences in fundamentals that Esteban so strongly emphasized, then you are going to get movements of people. In Esteban's model, it's 480 million people. But what I would like to suggest is when we look at the real world, when we look at people actually moving, it is not just agglomeration economies we should be worried about. We should also worry about how people are received in their destinations. There is emerging literature. There are people over here on this call that have contributed to it that show us quite strongly that the greater the number of refugees and migrants, the greater is the level of xenophobia that we see and votes for populist governments. In other words, that process of movement, while it is fundamental to economic activity, is not a benign activity when we see it. The other major issue that we saw, and there was a brief slide on this, and I'll talk a little bit more in Solomon's presentation, is the problem of tipping points. We've seen simulations across all these models that go from 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, 5 degrees, all the way up to 7 degrees Celsius. But we know from all of the science, if it's worth anything at all, that once you cross 3 degrees Celsius, you reach the danger of an inflection or a tipping point with domino effects. What does that mean in very simple language? You get heat, then the ice sheets will melt. If the ice sheets melt, this is going to release methane. If methane is released, it worsens greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. That will destroy your forests. That will change the climate system. You're going to get sea level rise, etc., etc. In other words, you get catastrophic damage, and you are in the world of Weitzman. If you're in the world of Weitzman, then it makes an awful lot of sense to say that what we should do is we should remain within the guardrails of the safe zone. Our economic policies should guide us and ensure that we don't cross those tipping points, which we think are somewhere around the 2 degrees, 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. So now I'm going to go to the next issue. So how can we ensure that we stay within the safe zone? And this is no easy issue, because we know that if we do absolutely nothing, we cross those guardrails, and there's a reasonable probability, a non-zero probability of catastrophic damage. But if we take actions, it's also going to be extraordinarily challenging. And one reason why it's going to be extraordinarily challenging is 75 to 80% of our energy globally comes from fossil fuels. And of course, we have to tackle that problem. I'm going to talk later on about agriculture. It's a much bigger problem that's grossly under-researched and under-investigated, I think, given that what we've got. So how can we start thinking about the problem? We can take a cue from something that Solomon gave us. Suppose we take the Stern-Stiglitz view of we need an optimal greenhouse gas tax of some kind, somewhere between the $75 range. The EU says it's $300. Let's not go that far. Let's say it stays between somewhere like $75. So what would be the formal incidence of a carbon tax, even if we don't have a carbon tax? If we get a regulation through duality theory, we can translate that into a tax. So let's say it's somewhere around $75 or $100. Then, as Solomon told us, that accounts for roughly 3 to 5% of GDP even before the economy starts adjusting to it. Once the economy starts adjusting to it, the economy will have to adjust to a supply side shock. Something that was free, the carbon sink, now begins to cost more money. So in some senses, it's less of an asset. It can be a liability for a lot of firms and a lot of countries that are heavily dependent upon that carbon. Can we resolve the problem and stay within the guardrails and the safe zone? I will conclude briefly by giving you 3 reasons for optimism by drawing on a different literature, and 3 reasons for concern, some of which you've already heard from our speakers. So the first reason for optimism, you've seen a little bit of this, is a dramatic decline in the cost of cleaner energy. If you look at that pink rectangle that we have, that's roughly the cost that we have at the moment of fossil fuels. If we look, for example, at some of the declines that we've had in solar power, they're beyond anyone's expectation. In about a decade, some of the solar power costs have fallen by 80%. Some of the wind power costs have fallen by 40%. That is genuine sign of optimism, because no one in the world had actually predicted it would be that big. And indeed, the stock market is going in the same direction in terms of having a penalty on investments in coal. The other issue that has been underexplored are the links that we have between greenhouse gases and the sorts of pollutants like PM2.5 that do terrible damage and cause mortality. If you look at the multipliers that comes from, say, $1 million of investment, what is the greenhouse gas that you get? What is the PM2.5 that you get? Globally, almost everywhere you see an 80% correlation. And that's without even going into the fact that most emerging infectious diseases emerge from the forests, from deforestation. Like COVID, no matter where the release was from, no one denies it was a zoonotic. The other potential reason for optimism is the fact that we all know that if we're going to decarbonize, we're going to have to invest and invest reasonably heavily. Some of the estimates are 2 to 4% of GDP. And if we don't take an extreme view of investment, this is possibly an opportunity in terms of what it does for economies, especially in developing countries. And indeed, it's also an opportunity for the $40 trillion of excess savings that is causing speculative distortions to be put to potentially better use. But there are concerns. The first concern, of course, and the biggest concern, and Carolina's team is, of course, working intensively on this, are the distributional impacts. And here I give you some results from Diego Kanzig's paper, and this is the paper that won the prize for the best thesis. Diego was, I don't know where he is now, at LBS. And this is from the UK, which has the best data on a lot of this, or at least that's what he claims. And he also claims to have very, very good identification. This is the response to the carbon price. What we clearly see are 2 effects happening over here. Firstly, a price effect. The poor people in richer countries, advanced countries, had to spend a larger share of their budget on carbon-intensive goods. So on the right-hand side, you see household income collapsing. Secondly, poorer people also are employed in the dirtier sectors, less skilled sectors, so they're hit harder by unemployment, which is the graph that you see on the left-hand side. Of course, in developing countries, that might be a little bit different. Agriculture, let me spend just a very quick few seconds on this. This is one of the biggest unresolved problems that we actually have. It's ignored a little bit in the climate change debate because it's often, or at least the mitigation side, because it's often argued it's only 25% of greenhouse gases, but that's non-trivial. It's also responsible for the bulk of forest loss, somewhere around 70%, consumes 80% of water. What we know is agricultural productivity, whether it's measured in terms of labor productivity, yields, or TFP, is about half, if not 40% of what it is in rich countries. And yet agriculture is the largest employer in developing countries, usually 60 to 80% of the labor force. And we also know that in most developing countries, almost all, without exception, all the growth that we've had in agricultural output has come at the expense of forests and natural habitats, which is clearly not sustainable. Then you add the results that you saw from Esteban and Solomon, which tell us that developing countries are going to be worst affected. I think there is a consensus that yields of major crops go down by 30 to 50%. How do we feed an extra 2 billion people over the next 50 to 100 years without destroying our resource base? What we don't have in agriculture is that steep decline in the costs of technology that you saw with energy. I'm going to end very, very quickly now. I think the biggest challenge that we have, by far the biggest, is the political economy challenge. We see policies across the world which induce maladaptation. For example, subsidize water use in a desert, subsidize people to go into places where they shouldn't go, that are flood prone, etc., etc. Forget about the mitigation challenge. It's even worse. Together with, as Solomon said, the need for different institutions of policies to induce global coordination. Because we know when we have global coordination, the costs of climate change can come down by 50%. So I'm going to end now with 3 points. I think the transition into the safe zone is feasible, but it's not non-trivial. I think it's feasible and doable because at least in the short run, I think, and I hope I've convinced you, there are some low-hanging options that yield co-benefits, things like health benefits, technology, and reducing the wastage in terms of bad policies. But I think our biggest problem is that the political economy challenge. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
Richard, and thanks again to both Solomon and Stefan. We have quite a few questions, a lot to chew, I think, from all three interventions, and little time. So that's a bad combination, but let me try to at least have a little bit of discussion in the time that we have left. And I want to sort of maybe group some of the questions and come back to both of you and give you a chance in that context to also maybe respond to anything that Richard said if you want to do so. So there were a series of questions around the issue of adaptation. And, you know, we heard from Solomon, he showed us some data that kind of suggested that for the most part, we see adaptation happening on sort of high, you know, at high income levels or high income economies. And then, you know, Stefan also showed us some of their results around adaptation, but a lot of those kind of rely on cross-border and cross-country mechanisms, right? Migration, trade. And then when I think about what we are doing as an institution, particularly in our engagement with low-income countries, we are really emphasizing adaptation. So I see a little bit of tension, right, between what we heard from you and some of what our own focus is on. So I was wondering, what are some of your thoughts in terms of, you know, what is it that low-income countries can do in the realm of adaptation, right, based on your own research? And then what's the role of domestic policy versus sort of international policy, you know, reacting to some of what Esteban said, right? So any sort of, you know, takes that you have on that, I think would be useful in our own thinking around this. So let me maybe start the opposite way. So maybe Esteban, I'll go first to you and then Solomon. And again, if in that context, you also want to sort of respond to some of Richard's comments, that would be great. Esteban.
Okay, thank you. And thanks to Richard for the interesting comments. So I should emphasize that a lot of the adaptation that it's happening in the type of framework that I showed, and I think this is kind of one of the key reasons why it's very important to have high spatial resolution, is that a lot of that adaptation exactly happens within countries. It doesn't have to happen across borders. It's, of course, very natural to think about migration restrictions, etc., across borders, or trade frictions across borders. But there's, of course, also trade frictions within countries that are quite important in terms of rural to urban migration, in terms of moving away from coastlines and the ability to transport goods and people, you know, once you move inland in some of these countries, etc. And so all of that plays into these costs of adaptation. So, you know, local infrastructure, for example, and think about local infrastructure and road networks and ability to kind of transport both goods and people within countries. We know that, you know, that's a big impediment in a lot of the developing world for trading, for example, or like I said, for people moving into, in some sense, quote unquote, opportunity, in the sense that they are, you know, stay in jobs and occupations, etc., that are not the ones that yield the highest return to them. And so I think this is exactly what's kind of playing with the shock. Here comes these temperature shocks. We need that adaptation to happen, and it's not happening partly because the cost of adapting within these countries is so high. So I think kind of a general change in emphasis from not only think about mitigation, but also thinking very seriously about adaptation and about these forms of local adaptation, not necessarily kind of cross-country adaptation. I mean, I think when we're talking centuries, I think the cross-country adaptation is very important. When we're thinking decades, I think within country adaptation is probably the kind of the key aspect. And certainly when we're thinking about coastal flooding or kind of sea level rise in general, that kind of local adaptation can be very powerful. But I think thinking about that adaptation, how can we help the local adaptation through this type of investments in infrastructure, for example, I think is very, very important. It's also very important to think about the cross-border one and the xenophobic kind of potential response and to climate immigrants that Richard was mentioning. I think that's essential, and that has the potential to really increase the costs a lot. So I think as part of the commitment of countries in terms of these issues, it should be not only about carbon emissions, it also has to be about how are we going to deal with this adaptation, and how are we going to commit not to close the borders when all these people and all these immigrants come knocking on the door.
I have just sort of two very specific points that I would message to any developing country that's thinking about this question. I would say, first of all, don't worry about climate change, just worry about climate. So adapt to your current climate. Right now, the fact that we can empirically observe effects of weather on all these different outcomes means that current populations today are not well adapted to the current climates they live in today. And so what people should be focusing on is making investments, policies, technologies that are going to protect populations from the type of environmental conditions they experience today that slow them down. And those investments, policies, and technologies, they're going to continue into the future. And if they work today, they will also protect populations against future climate changes. So it will have benefits in the future, but right now it's pressing for those populations today. And then the question of how do you determine what policies or technologies to deploy? We need RCTs. We need actual experiments. There's a lot of people out there selling ideas. There's very little evidence to support those sales. And so I think we really need to start thinking very practically about determining what is safe and effective for adaptation to be deployed today.
Thank you very much. We are against time. I'm going to check. Carlos, can we have 5 more minutes? Is that okay? There were a couple of questions that I want to get to. Or you want me to be really strict with the time?
I think 5 is fine. 5 minutes is fine, yes.
Let me maybe do one more round of questions and then just ask the two of you to be somewhat brief. There were a set of questions that came up around the issue of inequality that you talked about. And of course, I cannot be the chair of this meeting and not touch on that. So a couple of related questions. I think on your side, Solomon, it would be great to understand a little bit more what the mechanisms are behind your inequality results. You kind of showed us the final kind of outcome, but what are some of the channels that are driving those results? And I was very curious about any thoughts that you may have on the issue of weighting of contemporaneous populations that you sort of raised at the end. How should we be thinking about something like that? I don't think it's something we've done. And Stefan, in your case, you sort of talked about geographically, but there's a very clear mapping or, a high correlation between geography and current income levels, right? I mean, we have a lot of the high income countries being less affected and the low income countries being more affected, which I think raises some issues about incentives for big agreements and incentives for, preventive action. So I was wondering, you talked a little bit about this already, but I was wondering, in your results, you only looked at the effect of temperature, and you did say that, right? But we also know that high-income countries have more technology and more resources, right? And so once you bring those more endogenous issues, what would happen to inequality? If you can sort of tell us a little bit about that. So Solomon, over to you.
So on the sources of inequality, I think it's important to identify, and that was one of the directions going forward that I highlighted. I think there's a lot of evidence indicating that wealthier populations have resources and access to other types of like social networks and other things that they can use to protect themselves. And that is one way in which they mitigate effects of climate change more effectively. But there's also just a lot of correlation in the baseline conditions globally between populations that are poor today and populations that we expect to have a higher marginal impact of warming just because they're hot today. And so that really strong correlation drives at a global scale most of what we see. It's much less the effect of resources and much more the effect of just this initial conditions. And then on your question about weighting populations, I think this is a discussion that we need to have. How should we talked a lot about weighting populations across generations. I think in standard welfare economics, we talk a lot about weighting populations based on their marginal utility of consumption. And what has happened, for example, if you look at Bill Nordhaus's rice model, if you weight populations by the marginal utility of consumption, they produce totally implausible results. And so there's a fudge factor in there, which is we're going to weight by 1 over the marginal utility of consumption so that like we undo that effect and we create stable results. And so what that does is it just permanently penalizes countries that happen to be poor today. And that seems unacceptable. So I'm not sure what we should do, but I know that what I would say we should do is have a conversation.
Thank you. Esteban.
Yes, so I don't have a great insights into welfare economics and how to do that weighting. I mean, I think what we need to understand is kind of how it matters and you know, understand the kind of the underlying distribution of effects, and then you know people can aggregate in different ways, and we should do that and understand kind of the type of effects that Solomon was talking about. I mean, there's of course another issue, which is a lot of these policies that we're talking about also have implications on population size in the future. And so that's another thing that we have to cope with. How are we going to evaluate policies that imply, you know, that people may be better off, but there's going to be a lot less people on Earth, for example. And so we you know, a lot of the evaluation of these policies has to deal with this issue in some way. And so many times we just kind of deal with it without kind of explicitly acknowledging what we're doing by looking at, say, average welfare. But I mean, that's taking a very strong stand on that issue, because of course it's not valuing the fact that having more people may be, you know, a good thing. And let me say one thing about this ability to cope and like the poor places relative. I mean, one key issue there is the sectoral composition and the kind of the big differences in sectoral composition across the world, and the fact that agriculture is so much more important in parts of the developing world, and that's a sector that is particularly affected by temperature, and so you know, that's one of the reasons that these countries are very affected. But at the same time, there's the people that are poor. They also tend to have consumption baskets that are much more with shares that are much larger in agricultural goods than in other types of services and other manufacturing goods. And so you have this kind of effect by which as countries get or as areas get impacted by climate change, because they're so heavy in agriculture, people want to actually get poorer and want to consume more in agriculture. And so this is kind of like a little bit of a feedback effect, kind of negative feedback loop for some of these areas. So my co-author in this paper, Jose Luis Cruz, has a very nice paper exactly discussing this and emphasizing this type of channel, which I think is potentially very important, and one of the reasons why you know, we're going to see these areas kind of suffer even more, because it's very hard to move to sectors that are going to be less affected. And the reason it's so hard to move to those sectors is that you want to change your consumption basket towards the sectors that are exactly more affected.
Thank you so much again to both of you as speakers and Richard for, I think, an excellent set of comments. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. A plea from me is that, we got a lot of questions on the chat that I didn't manage to get to. So if you are staying with us for a few more minutes or for the rest of the session, and you have a chance to go to those and maybe answer some of those in the chat, that would be fantastic. And I hope that we can continue touching upon those issues in the next session. So thanks to both of you again. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm sure others did as well.